Well, among the events overshadowed by the shock US election result was a Pentagon revelation about civilian casualties caused by US airstrikes in Syria and in Iraq. An assessment carried out by US Central Command looked at 24 American strikes in Syria and Iraq over the past year. It says in total 64 people were killed, but it states that each incident complied with the law of armed conflict, despite, quote, the unfortunate outcome. The report also mentions that the anti-ISIL operation, of which the strikes were a part, cost the taxpayer around $9.3 billion. However, Amnesty International believes the US is significantly underestimating the civilian losses inflicted by coalition strikes in Syria. I'm pleased to say for more reaction from the group, we can now go live to Amnesty researcher on Syria, Neil Sammonds. Neil, welcome to the programme. The Pentagon states that coalition strikes killed 119 civilians in Iraq and Syria. That's since the launch of the anti-ISIL campaign back in 2014. How accurate are those figures, do you believe?
Well, while we appreciate to some extent that the US authorities have come forward and acknowledged a number of civilian deaths, we do, as you point out, feel that it's still pretty insignificant given the amount of killings which they've likely caused. So Syrian human rights organisations have documented at least 650 civilian deaths. We've looked in detail at 11 cases in which we believe 300 civilians were killed, and that's in Syria alone. So with them having now announced that something like 119 civilians have been killed across the two countries, that may be just, say, perhaps 10% or 5% of the true civilian death toll from US-led coalition attacks in the countries.
At the same time, the US believes none of those airstrikes contradicted the law of armed conflict, as it's known. Is that how you see it? Because in Syria, the US presence itself is a violation of international law in that it's not invited by the government there.
Well, we don't make a comment on the latter point,
okay,
although it's one which can be discussed elsewhere. But to do with the actual legality or not of those strikes, it's true, as you say, that the Pentagon announces that they did not find them to have breached international humanitarian law and that they had taken all feasible precautions to ensure that civilians were protected, but they have not made public on what grounds they found that. So we would urge them to make that information public, because we cannot second that at the moment, and we still have a lot of concerns that many of their attacks in both countries have likely violated international humanitarian law.
What could have been done to prevent civilian losses?
Yeah, it's hard to say without knowing too much about the details, but often if a IS target was hit or perhaps missed, perhaps more could have been done to ensure that civilians had left the area beforehand, that greater checks can have been done to make sure that civilians were not actually there. In certain circumstances, warnings can be given to civilians on the understanding that they should be allowed to return if they want to. So we think that probably the US authorities are failing to adequately assess the intelligence which they're provided, and they're not doing enough to acknowledge civilian deaths when they've taken place.
Am I right in saying that Amnesty presented its own research on the coalition strikes to US officials? If so, why was the Pentagon reluctant to include your findings in its report, do you believe?
Well, no doubt they have their reasons, and of course this would be a question best directed at them. We were a little bit disappointed that some 6 weeks after we submitted our memorandum, 27 pages of it, to the US authorities, we still have had no direct response for them. None of the actual 11 incidents we included were in those 24 incidents you mentioned, which are in the latest information from the Pentagon. We know that the US authorities are using more external information channels to try to corroborate or not their own information on civilian casualty allegations. But as far as we're aware, they have not yet looked at our own information. We encourage them, of course, to do that as soon as they can.
You mentioned acknowledgement by the US officials. Do you think that's enough in this cases with the number of deaths?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, we'd call upon all parties to the conflicts, when they can, not only to acknowledge the civilian casualties, but if possible, and of course there are significant security concerns in areas controlled or contested by Islamic State or otherwise, to try to pay some kind of compensation to families and victims where members have been killed or civilian infrastructure has been severely damaged, houses have been lost and so on. And we'd make the same call upon the Russian authorities for the far greater damage to civilian infrastructure and killings of civilians, which they have most likely carried out.
Well, they have always said that they will investigate claims of civilian deaths. That is one constant throughout this, that we've heard from Russian officials, that when the evidence is presented, they will go ahead and do that. If we can speak about Iraq for a moment, human rights groups have been alerted that the US-backed operation in Mosul is a looming humanitarian catastrophe. That was the word. How possible is it to avoid huge civilian losses, do you think, in such densely populated areas?
I mean, of course, it's extremely difficult, and we have really made our concerns known to the US in particular in the Mosul operations. When we looked at what happened in Manbij in Syria, when probably in the region of 250 civilians were killed for a place with some tens of thousands of civilians, you compare that with Mosul and around 1 million or more civilians, that there's a significant risk, particularly if these lessons are not being learned, that many more civilians will be killed. There is quite good evidence in a number of cases that Islamic State has probably used human shields to some extent, although it's quite difficult to fully assess the coercion or not, which might have been applied to family members and others who've accompanied convoys and so on. And similarly in other kind of like big cities like Aleppo, which are being hit or are likely to be hit, that much more can be done to try to ensure that civilians are not the victims there again.
Okay, that's the thoughts of Neil Hammond, Amnesty International researcher on Syria. Neil, thanks for your time this hour.